Nostalgia for the culture and architecture of ancient Rome tends to gloss over the fact that thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of freeborn Romans spent the entirety of their lives precariously close to the poverty line. Instead of relishing the philosophy, art, and literature of their society, these plebs spent the majority of their waking hours thinking of just one thing: getting enough bread to survive the day. Though conquest, slavery, and plunder gave upper-class Romans unprecedented wealth and power, chronic poverty remained a constant problem throughout the life of the city. This certainly wasn't unique to Rome, but it paradoxically grew exponentially worse as the Roman state became richer. Though the successions of the plebs tell us that there was always a motivated contingent of the working class willing to mobilize, the specific problem of bread enters our sources in the 2nd century BC, as the latifundia estates of the wealthy led to a precipitous decline in subsistence farming in Italy. With the slave labor force multiplying and smallholders being forced out by the estates, cattle breeders, or suburban developers, Rome saw the steady rise of a landless proletariat. The problem of dwindling farms was taken up by the reformist Gracchi brothers. Despite their blue-blooded aristocratic pedigree, the brothers understood the need for the patricians to reduce their holdings in order to rebuild Rome's agricultural base of yeoman farmers. The brothers served as tribunes of the plebs, and despite the fact that they were clearly acting in the interests of the state itself and the majority of its citizens, the brothers were both murdered by reactionary aristocrats. However, prior to his assassination, Gaius Gracchus laid the foundation for the most ambitious welfare program in the ancient world, one that transferred the duty to care for the poorest citizens from the private charity of patrician nobles to the Roman state itself. Initially, the program was nothing more than a subsidy that allowed for a set amount of grain to be purchased at a specific cost. Though it pales in comparison to what the grain dole eventually became, it cannot be overstated how radical this program was, since it took steps to sever the bonds of patronage that patricians had long used to ensure family loyalty among the plebeians. According to the legislation passed by Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC, the Republic would sell 5 modi, or about 72 pounds, of wheat to every citizen at the price of 6 1/3 asses. In addition to cutting out middlemen and patrons, Gracchus ensured that the state would pay for the transport of the grain, and he constructed vast storehouses to provide stability against price shocks in the event of a bad harvest. The supervision of the grain supply had long been the responsibility of the civic aediles, and the inauguration of this program made the office more influential. Like most things in Rome, there was a religious aspect to the grain supply itself. In Latin, the term used for grain supply was curia Annone, literally meaning the care of Annona, for she was the goddess that personified grain harvest and logistics. Furthermore, the grain dole was distributed from the Temple of Ceres on the Aventine Hill. This goddess was central to plebeian identity, undergirding popular support for Gaius Gracchus and his program. Though a massive boon to the poor of Rome, the grain dole was far from a true redistributionist project, and certainly does not merit the socialist label it can sometimes receive. In addition to not altering control over the means of production, the dole was financed not by higher taxes on the wealthy, but by an increased tax burden on the provinces. Sicily was initially the most important source of grain, though North Africa was also critical, and Egypt would emerge as the true breadbasket of Rome after being annexed by Augustus. Provinces bore the burden through increased requisitions, because throughout the greater part of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, Roman citizens living in Italy no longer paid taxes, other than fees associated with imports and on manumissions. Despite the fact that it imposed no burden on them, the Roman elite despised the system, just as they despised the urban poor themselves. Cicero described recipients of the grain dole as the wretched starving mob, the bloodsuckers of the treasury. Still, they recognized its popularity, and there were no efforts to abolish it outright by the conservative aristocracy until the arch-reactionary Sulla seized power as dictator. Using his tyrannical power, he abolished the dole, but his reforms did not last long. Rooting out corruption and price gouging in the city's grain supply would remain a central issue for the populare reformers that courted Rome's primary expanding demographic, the urban poor. The radical tribune Saturninus won office in part by establishing credibility through the effective supervision of grain imports at the port of Ostia, and built a massive popular following by advocating initiatives to further subsidize the price of grain. An ally of Gaius Marius, Saturninus was elected tribune 3 successive times before the Senate organized a reactionary plot against him that resulted in his assassination in 100 BC. On the eve of the Social War, class conflict in Rome intensified, and the tribune Drusus proposed redistribution of land and an expansion of the grain dole. He too was murdered before this legislation could be passed, and his death caused the issue to disappear for several years. After being eliminated by Sulla and subsequently reinstated, the dole took another step towards providing adequate support for Rome's poor when the radical tribune Clodius advanced a bill to provide free grain to 320,000 Roman citizens. Carried in 58 BC, this reflected a major component of the reform agenda being driven by Julius Caesar and the populares. Cicero estimated that the expanded grain dole accounted for 1/5 of the state budget at this time. Certainly lavish for the time, but this pales in comparison to what modern states are expected to spend on the welfare of their citizens. Because the land question had never been fully resolved, the passage of this generous addition to the grain dole encouraged the rural poor that had been struggling to make ends meet in the countryside to move to the city. Since the dole was only available to citizens, the wealthy even began freeing slaves that had outlived their usefulness. Now that they were fed at public expense, masters looked to cut costs that they had been hesitant to cut earlier out of fear of the social stigma that they would incur if their freedmen clients were seen begging for food. The increased urban proletariat would play a significant role in the armed street clashes that punctuated the 50s BC, the last stretch of time in which the Republic's politics could be said to be functioning as intended. Working-class collegia organized around Clodius to push back against the conservative-financed street gangs of Milo. The urban strife culminated in the murder of Clodius by Milo's gangs in 52 BC. Let me know if you are seeing the trend regarding the fate of popular reformers in the late Republic. Clodius's supporters retaliated by burning down the Curia, which was the primary meeting place of the Senate. In response to the chaos, the Senate removed the last remaining democratic fig leaf of the Republic and appointed Pompey as emergency overseer of the grain supply, and then later as sole consul. The move was as unprecedented as it was unconstitutional, and the Republic was dead well before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Still, cross he did, and after the fierce civil war between Caesar's populare faction and the aristocracy, represented by Pompey, Caesar took steps to simplify the dole and root out fraud. As dictator, he reduced the number of recipients to just 150,000 names. Though this was more politically viable, thanks to his passage of land reform in Italy and the funding of colonization efforts for 80,000 citizens abroad, our sources indicate that it was still very unpopular. But I suppose that one of the perks of winning a civil war and ruling as dictator for life is that public opinion doesn't interfere with the imposition of your agenda. Caesar increased the number of aediles from 4 to 6, with the new magistrates deemed the aediles cerealis and focused entirely on the ready supply of cheap grain. He also took steps to rein in the unchecked growth of the grain dole, adding new names to the list only when a vacancy appeared as the result of the death of a citizen or when a recipient moved out of the city. The end result was a 2-tiered system of Roman residents, where those who had long resided in the city maintained access to the dole, but newcomers were placed on a long waiting list. We do not know if this was Caesar's long-term plan. As with so many popular campaigners before him, he too was assassinated. But this reform, like many of the ideas he was working to implement during his brief reign as dictator, was abandoned after the Ides of March. As princeps, his successor Augustus would raise the number of eligible residents to 320,000, and though he reduced the number slightly after this, it would be the last time the dole shrank in size. From now on, it would only continue to grow, just like the wealth, influence, and population of the empire.